1 minute, he is on live television, laughing, looking invincible. The next morning, dead. No warning, no illness. Just a sudden, brutal cut to black. They buried him as a journeyman, but that is a lie. Earl the Twirl Cureton wasn't just a role player. He was the NBA's black box recorder. He was the shadow standing next to Dr. J. He was the witness inside the locker room of the bad boy Pistons. He was the man tasked with protecting a young Michael Jordan, and the only human being on earth who could tame Dennis Rodman when the cameras were off. From the mafia-style brutality of Detroit to the absolute house of horrors that was the Donald Sterling Clippers, Earl saw it all. He saw the betrayals, the dirty money, and the secrets that never made it to the cereal boxes. Why did a two-time champion punish his body in low-rent leagues until he was old enough to be a grandfather? What was he running from? And why does his sudden death feel like the end of an era that the league wants to forget? Forget the posters. Tonight, we are opening the file on the man who knew where all the bodies were buried. Welcome to the real history of the NBA. Oh, understand the man? You have to understand the ground he walked on. And let me tell you, the ground in Detroit in the late 1950s was shaking. Earl Cureton was born in 1957, right in the heart of the Motor City. But this wasn't the shiny, hopeful Detroit of the post-war boom. This was a city on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The factories were humming, sure, but the streets were whispering about a storm that was coming. Imagine growing up in a place where the American dream was parked right next to a nightmare. By the time Earl was 10 years old, the city exploded. The 1967 riots turned his neighborhood into a war zone. Tanks rolling down the street, smoke choking the sky. This wasn't a playground, it was a survival course. You learned to watch your back before you learned to dribble a ball. And Earl? He was watching, he was quiet. He was absorbing the chaos, learning that in this world, nothing is given to you. You take it or you get taken. But amidst the rubble and the racial tension, there was a sanctuary, a holy ground. St. Cecilia's. If you know, you know. St. Cecilia's wasn't just a high school gym. It was the Madison Square Garden of the ghetto. In the sweltering heat of summer, the best players in the world, Dave Bing, Jimmy Walker, guys who were making millions, would come to this dark, sweaty gym to play against the street legends. And the rules? There were no referees, not really. If you drove to the basket at the Saint, you were taking your life into your hands. You didn't call a foul unless you were bleeding, and even then, you better think twice. Earl Cureton was just a skinny kid with big ears and long arms, growing up in the shadow of this madness. He wasn't the chosen one. He wasn't the prodigy that everyone whispered about. He was the kid trying to get a run on the court while drug dealers and pimps bet thousands of dollars on the sidelines. Can you imagine the pressure? One missed layup, and you aren't just losing a game. You are costing a dangerous man a lot of money. This was the forge that made him. Earl learned very quickly that flashiness might get you applause, but toughness gets you respect. He learned that the elbows you throw when the referee isn't looking are the ones that count. He breathed in that Detroit dust, that mixture of steel and desperation. While other kids were dreaming of fame, Earl was learning the geometry of survival. But the streets of Detroit have a way of swallowing people whole. For a while, it looked like Earl might just be another name on a long list of could-have-beens. But he had a secret weapon, a move so unique, so strange, that it would give him a new name and a ticket out of hell. He stayed home. That is the first thing you need to know. When colleges came knocking, Earl didn't run off to California or New York. He stayed right there in the fire, enrolling at the University of Detroit Mercy. Now, today, that might sound like a small school, but back then, it was a powerhouse, and the man running the show was a screaming, bald-headed maniac named Dick Vitale. Yes, that Dick Vitale. The guy you hear yelling, "Awesome, baby," on TV. But before he was a broadcaster, he was a coach who demanded perfection. He was intense, he was loud, and he rode Earl Cureton like a jockey on a racehorse. Vitale saw something in this lanky local kid. He saw a motor that didn't stop. But Earl wasn't a traditional big man. He wasn't a towering giant like Kareem. He was 6'9", skinny, and he needed a way to score over guys who were stronger and meaner than him. Enter the twirl. It wasn't just a spin move. It was a tornado. Earl would catch the ball in the post, back his man down, and then, wham, he would spin so fast, with such violence and speed, that the defender would be left guarding a ghost. He would spin baseline, rise up, and dunk it before you knew he moved. The crowd at Callahan Hall would go absolutely berserk. "Earl the Twirl," they screamed. It was catchy, it was marketable, it sounded like a dance craze. But let's look at the dark side of the nickname. It became a label, the Twirl. It sounded fun, it sounded light. It made people think Earl was a finesse player, a softy. The scouts started whispering, "Yeah, he has a nice move, but can he bang? Can he take a hit?" They looked at his frame and they saw weakness. They didn't see the St. Cecilia's scar tissue underneath. They didn't understand that the spin move wasn't about showing off. It was about not getting killed by the goons in the paint. Despite averaging nearly 12 points and 9 rebounds, despite being a hometown hero, the doubt started to creep in like a fog. The NBA scouts were circling, scribbling in their notebooks. Too light. A tweener. Good for college, but the pros will eat him alive. Earl could feel it. He was the king of Detroit mercy, but he knew the kingdom was small. He was about to step out of the castle and into the wilderness. And then came the graduation. The safety net was gone. The roaring crowds of Detroit mercy were behind him. Ahead of him lay the 1979 NBA draft, a meat market where young men are weighed, measured, and sold to the highest bidder. Earl thought he had done enough. He thought the twirl was his golden ticket, but he was about to learn a harsh lesson about the business of basketball. The phone wasn't going to ring when he expected it to. In fact, when the draft night came, silence was the loudest sound in the room. 1979, the year everything changed. Magic Johnson went #1. The cameras were flashing, the champagne was popping, and the smiles were bright enough to blind you. But far away from the glitz and the glamour, in the shadowy corners of the draft, a different story was playing out. A story of disrespect. Earl waited, and he waited. The first round passed, the second round passed. Names were called that nobody even remembers today. Guys who would sell insurance 2 years later were walking up to the stage. And still, Earl sat there. Finally, way down at pick number 58, the Philadelphia 76ers made a call, 58th. Do you know what that number means in the NBA? It means you are meat. It means you are nothing. It means you are invited to training camp just so the real players have someone to dunk on. Most guys drafted that low quit. They go get a regular job. They know the math doesn't work. But Earl? He packed his bags for Philly with a chip on his shoulder the size of a boulder. He wasn't going there to be a practice dummy. He was going to war. But walking into that Philadelphia locker room, my God, it must have felt like walking into Olympus. There sat Julius Erving, Dr. J, the man who invented cool, the man with the afro blowing in the wind. And there was Daryl Dawkins, Chocolate Thunder, a man so strong he shattered backboards for fun, and here comes Skinny Earl from Detroit. The silence in that room must have been deafening. He wasn't welcomed with open arms. He was looked at like a piece of equipment. Earl quickly realized that the NBA wasn't about basketball. It was a caste system. The stars ate steak. The rookies ate scraps. The stars sat in first class. The rookies sat by the toilets on the plane. And the practice court? That was the killing floor. The veterans tested him. They threw elbows at his throat. They tripped him. They wanted to see if the kid from Detroit would break. They wanted to see if the twirl was just a cute nickname or if he had steel in his spine. Earl didn't break. He hit back. And that, right there, was the moment he earned his spot. Not with a dunk, but with a bruise. Fast forward to 1983. The Sixers are tired of losing. They are tired of being the bridesmaids. So they go out and get the ultimate weapon, Moses Malone, the chairman of the boards. Now, history books will tell you that the Sixers cruised to that championship. Foe, Moses said, predicting they would sweep every series, and they almost did. It looked easy on TV. But let me tell you the secret that nobody talks about. That championship was built on the broken body of Earl Cureton. Why? Because Earl had the worst job in professional sports. He was Moses Malone's personal sparring partner. Every single day in practice, Earl had to guard Moses, and Moses didn't know how to go 50%. Moses was a beast. He didn't just rebound the ball, he assaulted it. He threw his body around like a wrecking ball, and Earl was the wall he was smashing into. Imagine waking up every morning knowing your job is to get beaten up by the strongest man in the league. Earl would go home covered in ice packs, black and blue, barely able to walk. He wasn't getting the headlines. The newspapers were worshiping Dr. J and Moses. But without Earl taking that punishment in practice, without Earl pushing Moses to be sharper, meaner, and hungrier, there is no trophy. When they finally won it all, sweeping the mighty Lakers, the confetti fell. Earl Cureton was an NBA champion. He had the ring. He had the champagne soaking his jersey. But look at the photos from that parade. Look at his eyes. There is pride, yes. But there is also a strange distance. He knew the truth. He was a champion, but to the world, he was just a footnote. He had climbed the mountain, but the view was reserved for the giants. And deep down, a question was burning in his gut. Is this it? Is this all I am worth? A punching bag with a ring? And then, the twist that shocked everyone. You just won an NBA title. You are playing for one of the best teams in history. You are in the prime of your life. Logic says you stay, you build a dynasty, you cash in. Earl Cureton left. He packed his bags and flew across the Atlantic to Italy. He signed with Scavallini Pesaro. Why? Why would a champion leave the NBA? The official story was money. Italy was paying big bucks in the 80s, sometimes more than NBA bench players could make. But dig a little deeper, and you smell the smoke of a different fire. Was he pushed out? Did the Sixers decide he was expendable? Or did Earl simply get tired of living in the shadow of Moses? Italy in the mid-80s was a different planet. No private jets. No five-star security details. The fans there, they were fanatics. They lit flares in the stands. They threw coins at opposing players. It was passionate, chaotic, and dangerous. For Earl, it was a culture shock that would have broken a weaker man. He went from the structured corporate world of the NBA to the Wild West of Europe. But here is the irony. In Italy, Earl wasn't a role player. He was a god. The twirl became a sensation. He could dominate. He could score. He was the man. For the first time in his career, the offense ran through him. He tasted stardom. He tasted what it felt like to be Dr. J, even if it was in a smaller pond. However, the nights were long. He was thousands of miles from Detroit, from his family, surrounded by a language he didn't speak. There were whispers of loneliness, of the temptations that come when an American star is let loose in Italy with pockets full of cash. The wine, the women, the lack of oversight. It was a golden cage. He was a king in Italy, but he knew deep down he was missing the real show back home. He was watching his prime years tick away on a different continent, wondering if the NBA had already forgotten his name. And the scariest part? In the NBA, once you leave, they rarely let you back in. Earl was gambling with his entire career. Homecoming. Ideally, it is supposed to be sweet. You imagine the parade, the family in the stands, the feeling of putting on the jersey of the city that raised you. In 1983, Earl got his wish. He signed with the Detroit Pistons. He was back in the Motor City, but this wasn't the happy reunion you see in Disney movies. Earl was walking into a laboratory where a mad experiment was taking place. The Pistons were transforming. They were shedding their skin and becoming something the NBA had never seen before, and frankly, something the league was terrified of. They were becoming the bad boys. The locker room was commanded by Isaiah Thomas, the smiling assassin, and Bill Laimbeer, the darkest villain in basketball history. Laimbeer didn't play basketball. He played psychological warfare. He elbowed, he flopped, he agitated. And Earl? Earl was the Twirl. He was finesse. He was skill. He was a jazz musician in a heavy metal band. There was a friction there that the cameras didn't catch. Earl was a Detroit guy by blood, but the team's new philosophy was kill or be killed. He had to adapt. He had to harden his heart. Watching practice was like watching a prison riot. Laimbeer and Rick Mahorn were teaching the young guys that a foul wasn't a foul unless the other guy didn't get up. Earl had to survive in this toxic soup of testosterone and violence. And the tragedy? He was good. He gave them crucial minutes. He brought that championship DNA from Philly. But he could feel the shift. The team was moving towards a style of play that was ugly, brutal, and effective. And in that system, a guy with a smooth spin move was looked at with suspicion. Was he tough enough? Could he knock a guy out if Isaiah gave the order? Earl was playing for his own people, in front of his own friends from the old neighborhood. But inside the locker room, he was fighting to prove he belonged in this new, dark era of Detroit basketball. He helped lay the foundation for the championships that would come later, but he would never get the credit. When the bad boys finally lifted the trophies, Earl was gone, erased from the family portrait like a disowned relative. In the summer of 1986, Earl committed what many in Detroit considered high treason. He didn't just leave, he went to the enemy. He signed with the Chicago Bulls. To understand how crazy this was, you have to understand the hatred between Detroit and Chicago. It was biblical. It was hate, pure and simple. And here was Earl, crossing the battle lines. But he wasn't joining a dynasty. He was walking into a one-man show starring a 23-year-old maniac named Michael Jordan. People today see Jordan as a Zen master, a global icon. Earl saw the raw version. And let me tell you, the raw version was terrifying. Michael wasn't just competitive. He was cruel. He was a tyrant. The Bulls' locker room was silent, paralyzed by the fear of number 23. If you dropped a pass in practice, Michael wouldn't just yell at you. He would destroy you verbally, strip you of your dignity in front of everyone. Earl was a veteran. He had a ring. He played with Dr. J. He wasn't going to be bullied by a kid, even if that kid was God in sneakers. But the dynamic was twisted. Earl was brought in to provide toughness, to protect Michael. Imagine the irony. Yesterday, his friends in Detroit were plotting how to break Jordan's legs, and today, Earl had to stand in front of Jordan and take the bullets. He saw the Jordan rules from the other side. He saw his old teammates, Laimbeer, Mahorn, Rodman, beating the hell out of Michael every time he drove to the basket. And Earl had to step in. He had to push back against guys he had shared dinners with just months ago. It was psychological torture. He was a man without a country. To Detroit, he was a traitor. To Chicago, he was an outsider, a spy from the enemy camp. And through it all, he watched Jordan evolve. He saw the frustration in Michael's eyes as the Pistons beat them down, year after year. Earl was witnessing the forging of the ultimate weapon, but he knew he wouldn't be there when the weapon was finally ready to fire. He was just a mercenary passing through the war zone. If Detroit was a war zone and Chicago was a boot camp, then the Los Angeles Clippers were a mental asylum run by a slumlord. In 1987, Earl was traded to the Clippers. Today, the Clippers are a respectable franchise. Back then, they were the laughingstock of professional sports, and the reason had a name: Donald Sterling. This chapter needs to be whispered because the stories from that era are almost too gross to believe. Donald Sterling was not just a bad owner, he was a stain on the league. He ran the team like a cheap roadside motel. While the Lakers were sipping champagne and flying on private jets across town, the Clippers were flying commercial, squeezed into coach seats, their knees jammed into the tray tables. Earl walked into a locker room that smelled of defeat. The players knew the owner didn't care about winning. He cared about money and vanity. Sterling would bring his friends into the locker room while players were showering, treating the athletes like prize cattle at a fair. It was dehumanizing. It was gross. Earl was a professional. He tried to bring order to the chaos. He tried to mentor the young guys like Benoit Benjamin, a talented giant who was slowly rotting in that toxic environment. But how do you motivate men when the owner is heckling his own players from the courtside seats? Yes, Sterling would actually heckle his own team. It was a circus. For Earl, this was the low point. He had gone from the nobility of Dr. J to the grit of the bad boys to the brilliance of Jordan. And now he was in the gutter of the NBA. But this is where the character of the man was revealed. He didn't quit. He didn't fake an injury to collect a check. He played hard in an empty arena for a team with no hope, under an owner who viewed him as property. This was the dark night of the soul. This was where the Twirl had to decide if he loved basketball enough to endure the humiliation of being a Clipper in the 80s. Most players' careers died in that Clippers jersey. Earl refused to die. He was plotting his escape, but the exit door seemed a million miles away. 1988. The NBA decides to expand. They create the Charlotte Hornets. Now for the fans in North Carolina, this was a party. The ones they need. And then they leave the rest. The old, the expensive, the troublemakers, exposed. Earl Cureton was left exposed by the Clippers. He was picked up by Charlotte. It sounds like a new beginning, doesn't it? But walk a mile in those high-top sneakers. Earl walked into a locker room that was essentially a refugee camp. Every player there had been told by their previous team, "We don't want you anymore." You had Kelly Tripucka, a scorer who was seen as one-dimensional. You had Muggsy Bogues, the 5'3" wonder who everyone thought was a circus act. And you had Earl, the veteran, the glue. The losing was catastrophic. When you play for an expansion team, you don't just lose, you get pummeled, night after night. You are the Washington Generals playing against the Globetrotters. He was watching his knees ache a little more every morning. He was watching rookies run past him. And the money? Let's talk about the finances. Earl was making around $180,000. The glamour was gone. This was blue-collar basketball, punching the clock in a teal jersey, wondering if the phone would ever ring from a contender again. He was a hornet, but he felt like a ghost. The NBA is a cruel lover. After the stint in Charlotte, the phone stopped ringing. The silence was deafening. The league had moved on. They wanted the next Shaq, the next Penny Hardaway. They didn't want a 32-year-old rebounder with a weird spin move. So, in 1989, Earl did the only thing he knew how to do. He packed his bags again. He went back to Italy. But this wasn't the fun, youthful adventure of his 20s. This was different. He signed with Philips Milano, a legendary club, yes. But the context had changed. He wasn't the young American star anymore. He was the hired gun, expected to deliver championships immediately. The pressure in European basketball is suffocating. If you lose a game in the NBA, you go to the next city. If you lose a game in Italy, the fans wait for you outside the arena. They take it personally. Earl was playing alongside Bob McAdoo, another NBA legend who had been exiled to Europe. He was watching the NBA highlights on grainy VHS tapes sent from home. He saw the Pistons, his old team, winning championships without him. That stings. That burns a hole in your stomach. To the scouts in the U.S., Earl Cureton was officially retired. He was a name in an almanac, a relic of the Dr. J era. Nobody expected to see him again. 1991 to 1993. These are the years that should have ended the story. If this were a normal biography, the screen would fade to black here. Earl was out of the NBA. He was out of the top European leagues. He entered the basketball underground. He played in the USBL, United States Basketball League. He played in the CBA, Continental Basketball Association. Do you know what the CBA was in the early 90s? It was a graveyard of dreams. It was long bus rides through snowstorms in North Dakota. It was staying in Motel 6. It was playing in high school gyms where the showers barely had hot water. The paychecks were small, sometimes bouncing. Why? Why would a man with 2 NBA Finals appearances subject himself to this? Why run up and down the court with hungry 20-year-olds trying to take your head off? Pride? Addiction to the game? Or was it simply that he refused to let them tell him when it was over? He even went to France for a cup of coffee. He was a nomad, a ronin, a warrior without a master. His friends told him to quit. Earl, hang it up. You had a great run. Why are you embarrassing yourself in the minor leagues? But Earl knew something they didn't. He kept his body ready. He didn't get fat. He didn't stop training. He treated a game in Sioux Falls like it was Game 7 of the NBA Finals. He was waiting for a miracle. He was waiting for one general manager somewhere to look at his roster and say, "We need a grown man." It was a lottery ticket with 1 in a million odds. Most guys in the CBA never make it back up. They rot there. But Earl Cureton was about to receive a phone call that would prove that sometimes, just sometimes, stubbornness is the greatest talent of all. Picture this. It is the middle of the 1993 season. Earl Cureton is sitting in a cheap hotel room, icing his knees, staring at the ceiling. He is playing in the CBA. The pay is lousy. The travel is worse. Most guys his age, 36 years old, are already coaching or selling cars or sitting on a porch somewhere complaining about their backs. The NBA is a young man's game, and the door had slammed shut on Earl years ago, or so everyone thought. Then the phone rang, and on the other end of the line was the Houston Rockets. This wasn't a prank. The Rockets were a serious team. They had Hakeem the Dream Olajuwon, the most graceful big man to ever play the game. They were chasing a championship, but they had a problem. They needed insurance. They needed someone who had been to the mountaintop, someone who wouldn't wet the bed when the pressure got too high. They called it a desperation move. They said Houston was scraping the bottom of the barrel. But the Rockets coach, Rudy Tomjanovich, knew exactly what he was doing. It is the kind of whiplash that gives you the bends. He suited up not as a star, but as a guardian. His job was simple: be ready. If Hakeem gets in foul trouble, if Otis Thorpe needs a breather, you go in there and you hold the line. You don't need to score 20 points, you just need to not back down. And Earl? He had been waiting in the mud for 3 years for this exact moment. The 1994 NBA Finals, Houston Rockets versus the New York Knicks. If you are old enough to remember this series, you know it wasn't pretty. It wasn't the high-flying circus of today. It was a street fight. It was ugly, low-scoring defensive trench warfare. Pat Riley's Knicks were thugs. They hit hard. For Earl, this was familiar territory. This was just like the playgrounds of Detroit. He didn't play big minutes. Let's be honest about that. But his value wasn't in the box score. His value was in the huddle. When the young guys started to panic, when the pressure of Game 7 was crushing their chests, they looked at Earl. And Earl was calm. He had been there in 1983 with Dr. J and Moses. He knew the smell of fear, and he knew how to conquer it. And then the buzzer sounded. Game 7 was over. The Rockets were champions. Earl stood on the court, soaked in champagne for the second time in his life. But look at the math. The first ring was in 1983. The second ring was in 1994. 11 years. 11 years of wandering the wilderness. 11 years of being traded, cut, exiled to Italy, and forgotten in the minor leagues. Most players win their rings in a cluster, back to back. To win one, disappear for a decade, and then come back from the dead to win another? That is unheard of. It validated everything. All those cold nights in French gyms, all those bus rides in the CBA, it was all worth it for this one moment of redemption. He wasn't just a former champion anymore, he was a current champion. The Twirl had survived the test of time. You would think that after winning a title at 36, he would ride off into the sunset. The story has a perfect ending, right? Wrong. Earl Cureton didn't know how to quit. 2 years later, in 1996, a weird thing happened. The NBA expanded into Canada. The Toronto Raptors were born. They had those crazy purple jerseys with the giant red dinosaur on the front. It was the 90s in full swing. And who did they call to help babysit this new franchise? Grandpa Earl. Earl was old enough to be their father, but here is the incredible part. He played. He actually played. In a game against the Mavericks, the old man came off the bench and dropped points like he was 25 again. He was setting screens that felt like hitting a brick wall. He was teaching the young Raptors how to be professionals. Imagine the physical toll. At that age, your knees have no cartilage left. Your back screams every time you get out of bed. Every morning was a ritual of painkillers, stretching, and ice baths, just to get the machine moving. But Earl loved it. He loved being the OG, original gangster, of the locker room. He was the bridge between the old NBA of the 70s and the hip-hop NBA of the late 90s. He was the last of the Mohicans, still spinning, still fighting, refusing to let the light go out. But even for the average person, retirement is a goal. You work 40 years, you get a gold watch, you go fishing. But for a professional athlete, retirement is a first death. You die at 40. Everything you were, the cheers, the travel, the adrenaline, the identity, is stripped away overnight. Earl woke up one morning and realized nobody cared anymore. There was no game to prepare for, no plane to catch, no crowd screaming his name. The phone, which used to ring off the hook with agents and coaches, went dead silent. This is the part of the documentary they usually skip, but it is the most dangerous time in a player's life. This is when the depression sets in. This is when the money runs out. This is when guys turn to the bottle or the needle to replace the rush of the game. Earl had to reinvent himself. He wasn't the Twirl anymore. He was just a tall, middle-aged man in Detroit. He tried business. He tried broadcasting. But nothing tasted like the NBA. It was a withdrawal, plain and simple. He was an addict, and his drug was competition. He watched from the sidelines as the game evolved. The bad boy era was dead. He was stuck in the void, searching for a purpose, wondering if the best part of his life was already written on a plaque somewhere, collecting dust. Fast forward to 2003, 6 years in the wilderness. Then an opportunity appeared. But it wasn't the NBA, it was the ABA. Now you have to understand, the original ABA of the 70s was cool. It gave us the Afro and the Slam Dunk Contest. But the new ABA in the early 2000s, it was a circus. It was a league held together by duct tape and crazy dreams. Teams would fold in the middle of the season. Paychecks were theoretical. Earl was hired to coach the Long Beach Jam, a team in California. It sounds glamorous, right? Wrong. This wasn't the Lakers. This was minor league grind. He was the head coach, the father figure, and sometimes the therapist for a group of guys who were either too young to know better or too old to quit. But Earl saw something in this chaos. He saw a chance to prove that he wasn't just a body, he was a brain. He wanted to show the world that he understood the X's and O's better than the guys in suits gave him credit for. He took the job seriously. He wore the suit, he drew up the plays. And then the owners of the team decided they needed a publicity stunt. They didn't just want to win games, they wanted to sell tickets. They wanted a freak show. So the man who wore wedding dresses, married himself, kicked cameramen, and partied in Vegas while the NBA Finals were going on. By 2004, Rodman was over 40. He was a caricature of himself. They said Rodman would destroy the team, destroy the locker room, and leave a trail of destruction behind him, and he might have if the coach had been anyone else. But the coach was Earl Cureton. Why did Rodman listen to Earl? Because Earl was the one guy Dennis couldn't intimidate. Earl had been there. Earl had seen Dennis when he was a shy, stuttering janitor before he became a superstar. There is a famous story about Rodman showing up late or wanting to skip practice to go do a media event. Any other coach would have screamed. Earl? Earl just looked him in the eye and said, "Dennis, I need you to rebound. I don't care about the hair. I don't care about the piercings. Just get me the ball." It worked. It was a miracle of psychology. Earl became the Rodman whisperer. He managed the chaos. With Earl pacing the sidelines and Rodman dominating the boards like a man half his age, the Long Beach Jam didn't just sell tickets. They won the championship. It was Earl's third ring, one as a player in Philly, one as a player in Houston, and now one as a coach in the ABA. It proved that Earl Cureton wasn't just a passenger on championship teams. He was the driver. He took a team of misfits and a washed-up superstar and turned them into gold. It should have been his ticket to an NBA head coaching job, but as we know, the NBA is a club, and Earl was still waiting for his VIP pass. They say you can never go home again. They say the city changes, the people change, and the memories turn sour. But in 2013, Earl Cureton proved the old saying wrong. He didn't just go back to Detroit, he became Detroit. The Pistons organization made a call. They didn't need a center, they didn't need a coach, they needed a soul. The franchise was going through a rough patch. The glory days of the going-to-work team were fading. The arena was getting quieter. They needed someone who embodied the grit, the history, and the blue-collar work ethic of the Motor City. Who better than the kid from St. Cecilia's? Earl. But if you think Earl Cureton treated it like a vacation, you haven't been paying attention. Earl turned the job into a mission. He wasn't hanging out in the VIP suites. He was in the trenches. He was visiting the juvenile detention centers where the kids looked at him with hard, distrustful eyes he recognized from his own childhood. He was delivering turkeys on Thanksgiving in the freezing Michigan cold, his hands numb, but his smile lighting up the block. He was going into schools where the ceiling tiles were falling down and telling kids, "I walk these same streets. I dodged the same trouble. If I made it out, so can you." This was his redemption. Remember, he had left Detroit for the Bulls. He had been the enemy, but the city forgave him because they saw he wasn't faking it. He wasn't checking a box. He was pouring his energy back into the soil that raised him. He became the face of the Pistons for a generation that never even saw him play. He was the Uncle Earl of the city, the guy who would always stop to sign an autograph, the guy who never acted like he was too big for the room. He was building a monument, not of stone, but of goodwill. But he returned to his alma mater, the University of Detroit Mercy, to work as a broadcaster and analyst. He also took to the radio waves for the Pistons. Now, modern sports broadcasting is often very polished, very safe. You have guys who are afraid to criticize the superstars because they want to be friends with them. They talk about analytics and efficiency. Earl Cureton didn't care about your spreadsheet. He cared about heart. Listening to Earl on the radio was like sitting on a bar stool next to a legend. He was unfiltered. When he saw a modern player sit out a game because of load management or a sore pinky finger, Earl would let them have it. "In my day," he would growl, "Moses Malone would have played on one leg. We didn't take nights off because the calendar said so." He became the voice of the old school. He reminded the listeners that basketball used to be a contact sport. He told stories about the elbows of Bill Laimbeer and the trash talk of Larry Bird. He wasn't just calling the game, he was teaching history. He was bridging the gap between the eras. And the fans loved him for it. In a world of sanitized, PR-friendly sound bites, Earl was authentic. He was the truth. He was happy. You could hear it in his laugh. He was back at his university, watching young kids try to make it, just like he did in the 70s. He was mentoring them, guiding them, protecting them from the sharks he had encountered. It felt like the perfect third act of a movie. The warrior returns home to train the next generation. But tragedy rarely announces its arrival. It waits until you are comfortable. It waits until you think you have all the time in the world. Here is the thing that makes this story so haunting. Earl Cureton didn't look old. In fact, he looked incredible. At 66 years old, most former NBA players are broken. They walk with a limp, their backs are fused. They carry 50 pounds of extra weight because they can't run anymore. But Earl? Earl looked like he could still give you 10 minutes in the playoffs. He was slim, he was fit. He had energy that men half his size envied. People would ask him, "Earl, what is the secret? Is it a special diet? Is it yoga?" He would just smile that famous smile. He seemed to have discovered the fountain of youth. He was active, constantly moving, constantly working. He didn't have the gray, tired look of a man slowing down. This appearance created an illusion of immortality. When we looked at Earl, we saw strength. We saw a survivor. We assumed that because he looked healthy on the outside, everything was perfect on the inside. We assumed he would be around for another 20 years, telling stories and laughing on the sidelines. But the human body is a master of deception, especially the bodies of giants. We often forget the strain that is placed on the hearts of men who are 6'9". The engine has to work harder to pump blood through that massive frame. The wear and tear isn't always visible. It hides in the arteries and the electrical signals of the heart. There were no headlines about Earl being sick, no reports of hospital visits. He was the picture of vitality, and that is what made the silent killer so terrifying. He was walking around with a ticking clock inside his chest, and nobody, perhaps not even Earl himself, heard the countdown. He was winning the battle against aging publicly, while losing a secret war internally. In late 2023, just months before the end, Earl did something he had been promising to do for decades. He published his memoir, City of Detroit, The Earl Cureton Story. Now, athletes release books all the time. Usually, they are ghost-written fluff pieces meant to sell a few copies at the airport. But looking back now, the timing of Earl's book sends a shiver down your spine. It feels fated. It feels like he knew, on a subconscious level, that the fourth quarter was ending, and he needed to get his statement on the record before the buzzer sounded. The book wasn't just a victory lap, it was a confession. In those pages, Earl opened up about the things that eat away at a man in the spotlight. He wrote about the financial terror of the early days, where an injury meant poverty. He wrote about the loneliness of those hotel rooms in Europe. He settled old scores and paid tribute to forgotten friends. He wanted the world to know that his 2 championship rings weren't gifts. They were receipts for the pain he had endured. He spent the last months of his life promoting this book. He was going to signings, shaking hands, telling the stories one last time. It was his swan song. He was cementing his legacy, making sure that when he was gone, the history books would get the spelling of his name right. He handed us the blueprint of his life just before he walked out the door. If he had waited 6 months, if he had procrastinated, the stories would have died with him. It was his final assist to the basketball world. Saturday, February 3rd. A day that felt completely, beautifully normal. Earl Cureton woke up and did what he loved most. He went to work. He drove to Callahan Hall to cover the Detroit Mercy Titans game against Robert Morris. He was back in the building where the Twirl was invented. If you look at the footage from that day, it is haunting. Earl looks fantastic. He is wearing his headset, laughing with the other broadcasters. He is analyzing the game with that sharp basketball mind. He is high-fiving fans. There is zero indication, zero, that the system is failing. He isn't clutching his chest. He isn't out of breath. He is vibrant. He spent the day surrounded by love. He was with his daughter, who he adored. He was making plans for the next week. He was talking about the Super Bowl. He was talking about the Pistons' upcoming schedule. That is the cruelty of death. It doesn't always send a warning note. It doesn't always give you a chance to say goodbye. It waits until you are happiest, until you are comfortable, and then it stands in the shadows, checking its watch. Earl went home that night, probably feeling good about the broadcast. He probably had a light dinner, watched some highlights, and went to bed thinking about Sunday morning. He closed his eyes, expecting another sunrise. He had no idea that he had just called his final game. Sunday morning. The city of Detroit was waking up to a gray, winter sky. And then, the sirens. Emergency services were called to Earl's home in Farmington Hills. It was sudden, a collapse. The medical details that came out later were vague, but the conclusion was absolute. There was no long battle, no hospital stay. The heart that had pumped for 66 years, the heart that had survived the riots, the drafts, the trades, and the rigors of professional sports, simply stopped. The news didn't trickle out, it exploded. When the notification hit the phones of NBA players, executives, and fans, the reaction was universal denial. No, that's a mistake. I just saw him yesterday. He was on TV 12 hours ago. Earl is indestructible. Isaiah Thomas, the toughest man in basketball, was broken. The Pistons organization went into a state of shock. It wasn't just that a former player had died, it was that the spirit of the building had vanished. The energy that Earl brought, the handshake that could crush a rock, the laugh that echoed in the hallways, was gone. The official statement mentioned unexpectedly passed away. It was a polite way of saying that a bolt of lightning had struck out of a clear blue sky. There were no drugs, no foul play, just the terrifying fragility of the human vessel. One minute you are a legend, a father, a friend. The next minute you are a memory. The silence in Detroit that morning was heavier than any snowstorm. The man who had been the bridge between the generations had collapsed, and suddenly the chasm felt very, very wide. Now that the dust has settled, we have to ask the hard question: why does Earl Cureton matter? He wasn't an all-star. He isn't in the Hall of Fame in Springfield. If you look at the raw numbers, he averaged 5 points a game. On paper, he is average. But tear up the paper lies. Earl Cureton was the Forrest Gump of the NBA. Look at the timeline. He was there when Dr. J was flying. He was there when the bad boys were fighting. He was there when Jordan was rising. He was there when Hakeem was dreaming. He was there when Vince Carter was dunking. He was the thread that stitched the entire history of modern basketball together. He proved something that every person watching this video needs to understand. You don't have to be the king to be royalty. You don't have to be the guy taking the last shot to be the reason the team wins. Earl was the ultimate glue guy. He was the one setting the screen that freed the superstar. He was the one talking in the rookie's ear on the bus, keeping him sane. We live in a world that worships the alpha. We worship the guys who score 50 points and demand trades. But Earl represented the other side of the coin, the nobility of service, the dignity of doing the dirty work. He showed us that a career isn't defined by how many sneakers you sell, but by how many people respect you when you walk into a room. And when Earl walked into a room, from the projects of Detroit to the penthouses of Manhattan, everyone stopped to pay respect. That is a currency more valuable than Bitcoin. The first game after he died, the Detroit Pistons played the Orlando Magic. The atmosphere in Little Caesars Arena was heavy. It felt like a church. They placed a jersey on his seat, a simple black chair with a jersey draped over it. It was such a small gesture, but it screamed louder than any cheering crowd. That chair represented the hole in the universe that Earl left behind. The players wore a black stripe with the number 24. But the real tribute wasn't on the uniforms. It was in the eyes of the people in the building. You saw grown men, hardened athletes, wiping away tears. Isaiah Thomas, a man who rarely shows weakness, looked like he had lost a brother, because he had. Earl the Twirl Cureton didn't just die. An era died with him. He was the last link to a time when basketball was grittier, tougher, and somehow more human. He was the bridge between the street and the suite. So tonight, as we close this file, don't remember Earl as the guy who averaged 5 points. Remember him as the survivor. Remember him as the man who was told he was too skinny, too old, too washed up, and answered by winning championships in 3 different decades. Remember the spin move that defied physics, and maybe, just maybe, learn the lesson he was trying to teach us all along. The game doesn't end when the buzzer sounds. The game ends when you stop impacting lives. And by that measure, Earl Cureton is still the MVP. The lights in the arena eventually go out. The fans go home. The noise fades. But in the quiet corners of Detroit, in the echoes of St. Cecilia's gym, if you listen closely, you can still hear the squeak of sneakers and a deep, booming laugh. The twirl is gone, but the spin goes on forever. Good night.